Good evening, and welcome to another episode of Historia Mystoria here inside the dungeon. Today's mystery: did Christopher Columbus really discover America? Stay tuned and find out. Christopher Columbus. We all know from elementary school that he supposedly found America. In 1492, he sailed the ocean blue across the Atlantic Ocean and landed in America. But that couldn't be farther from the truth. No, you see, it wasn't Christopher Columbus that found America. As a matter of fact, it was these guys. Yeah, that's right, the Vikings. No, not the Minnesota Vikings. The Nordic Vikings. Those are the ones who really, when you want to get down to the nitty-gritty, found or truly discovered America. But we're going to be talking about Christopher Columbus. And so, if he didn't discover America, why is it that Christopher Columbus is so important to American history? Today, we're going to find out. First, let's take a look at today's character profile. Christopher Columbus, or Cristoforo Colombo, was born in 1451 in the port city of Genoa, Italy. Yes, a port city, really the center of the northwestern Italian port cities, mostly known for their ship and merchant ships that were able to trade things up and down the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And he was born into a family who knew a lot about sailing, knew a lot about merchant ships, and so honestly, Christopher Columbus actually grew up pretty much on ships. By the age of 14, Christopher Columbus was working as a sailor on a local merchant ship, and so he learned the trade very early on in his life. He was able to know how to navigate and how to read maps and many other things. But the one thing that most people don't understand, Christopher Columbus was not a people person. He was very unlikable, as you'll find out if we move forward in everything that Christopher Columbus was able to do. Social skills was probably not one of the best things that he was known for. Now, Christopher Columbus, of course we know, wanted to try and sail across to the west, sail across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, that might not seem like a big deal to us today because we do it all the time. But back then, no one was doing it, or people who were trying to do it would go across the Atlantic Ocean and never return, feared that they had died somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. As a matter of fact, the European settlers, or excuse me, the European explorers, didn't even call the Atlantic Ocean that at that time. It was known as the Sea of Darkness. For obvious reasons, people would leave and never return. So no one really knew what was across the Atlantic Ocean. Everyone knew that, you know, possibly there was a way to get to the west, but then there were those explorers out there and many people in the world who still believed that the world was flat and that there's no way you could sail across because you would just fall off the end of the world. And so many people were too scared to take an adventure like this. Christopher Columbus was not one of those men. He really was an adventurous type of man. He felt like there was a way to get to the Western world, India, Asia, a lot quicker, because as of right now, the only way to do it was to sail through the Mediterranean Sea, which we know, of course, had been completely monopolized by the Roman Empire. And because of that, he gets this bright idea that he's going to travel to the west and become the first man to get to Asia by sailing to the west. Now, we all know the story that he sailed the ocean blue in 1492, but before we get there, the story was a little bit more difficult for him. And he eventually goes to King John in Portugal in 1484. And he's looking for money, he's looking for ships, because remember, he doesn't have all these things to himself, and he wasn't going to get it from the Italian government as well. And to do this, he goes to King John in Portugal. Now, what's interesting about King John in Portugal, he looks at him like he's a complete maniac. Like, are you crazy? I'm not going to give you money. I'm not going to waste my ships and time because I know that you're not going to come back alive. You're just going to be eaten by the Sea of Darkness. And so King John refuses his request in 1484. Now, most people would give up, but Christopher Columbus did not. He tries again, and instead of in Portugal, he moves on from King John in Portugal, and he moves to Spain. And here he goes to the King and Queen in Spain, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. Now, the two different monarchs here, the King and the Queen was actually the one who was more adventurous. The King was very, I don't know, let's see what the word would be, cautious maybe, because he was just like King John in Portugal, little naive about could someone really get to Asia by sailing to the west. But in 1485 he asked anyway, but they deny to finance his voyage. And here's the reason why. It's not because they didn't want him to go, it's because the Spanish were in the middle of a war. No, they weren't fighting the French. No, they weren't fighting the British. They were fighting the Moors. Yes, the Moors. And it wasn't until 1492, when the war was over, that Queen Isabella was able to actually convince King Ferdinand to allow the finances to fund the voyage for Christopher Columbus. And in 1492, he actually gets to go on his first voyage. And so that's just a little bit of the background, quick nutshell story of Christopher Columbus and how he gets to go on his first voyage. And when we return here on Historia Mystoria, we'll talk about that first voyage and why it's so important to American history. So Christopher Columbus's first journey, what was it like? Was it easy? Was it hard? Were there roadblocks? Of course. We know that at that time there would have been a million different things that could have gone wrong. We're talking about ships that were not built to travel long distances across, very rocky seas like the Atlantic Ocean would have been in the middle of it at that time. But Columbus was given 3 ships. We know them as the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Now, we're not going to get into that as much here in the video, but he was also given 90 men. Now, a lot of these men were former military men who had just gotten off fighting a war with the Moors. They would rather probably be home. And many of them took offense to actually having to kind of take orders from an Italian man. So think about that. You're a Spanish military man now taking orders from an Italian captain of these ships. And so that was one thing that would be very difficult for these Spanish sailors to deal with as well along the journey. And so as we take a look at the first journey here today, understand that the crew, by the time they got out of the Canary Islands and got on their way, realized that Christopher Columbus was not a nice man. We think of him in America as a hero, as the man who found America, but that's not really the case at all. He was not a well-liked man. He did know what he was doing. He was a great captain. He was a great cartographer. He was a great navigator. But it was the way that he dealt with people that kind of rubbed everyone the wrong way. And on the way out, about halfway through the voyage, the men who were working for Christopher Columbus actually tried to mutiny. Yeah, they actually tried to overthrow him. But then they realized, hey, wait a second. If we overthrow him or we, kill him or whatever, we don't know the way back. We're out here in the middle of nowhere. Only Christopher Columbus knows the way back. And so they decided that would be obviously counterproductive, and they continued to go on their ways and having to, take the orders from Christopher Columbus. Now, after they left the Canary Islands, which was the place where they left from southern Spain, and they went to the Canary Islands to get the supplies, they actually went straight across, as you can see behind me here, the actual sea. And it's interesting that he was able to sail straight. Now, you'll notice that about halfway through they ran into something, whether it be a storm, hurricane, we don't really know, kind of bumped up out of the way, and then was able to get back on the right track. Now, what's interesting here is it was very difficult to sail across the current, because not only are you fighting wind, but you're also fighting the current that typically flows towards the east in the Atlantic Ocean. So luckily these new caravel ships that he was able to apprehend here was able to help with that. We'll talk about that more in class tomorrow. Now, As they finally get to where they were going, he kind of funnels south as they hit the southern Atlantic, and he lands on land that he found. Of course, he's thinking, man, that was really quick for us to get to India. He hadn't really hit India at all. He had actually run into what we know today as Hispaniola. Now, Hispaniola, of course, that being Cuba today, that being the Dominican Republic, and that being Haiti. And he was able to survey the land for gold. He kept some of the people there, set up a very small settlement, and was able to return to Spain. Now, he went back to Spain and told King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella what he had found. And of course, knowing that by now he wasn't in India, they had found what perhaps was new land. And the king and queen were exceptionally excited. And so when we return here on Historia Mystoria, we'll talk about not his second voyage, but his third voyage and what happens next. And welcome back. And now we're going to talk about Christopher Columbus's third voyage. Now, we're going to skip over the second voyage. Kind of the same thing as the first, was surveying for more gold, found a little bit more new land, took some more things back, brought some more things over. But on the third voyage, Columbus was actually forced to use prisoners. Yes, prisoners from the Spanish prisons. Now, why is that, you might ask? It's simple. Most people by now were getting used to the point that I'm not going to work for this man. He's very, very difficult to deal with. You have to take orders from an Italian sailor. And so there weren't those men who were voluntarily or even willing to go without being forced by the king and queen to go. And so by the third voyage, many were not able to go. And so he was forced to use these prisoners. And you can imagine what that would have been like. Okay, think about these men who are just happy to be out of the prisons. Now they're on a ship. You've got a bunch of prisoners against one man. And Columbus was having a very difficult time, obviously, trying to get orders across. And to make an example out of someone, he decided that he was going to hang one of the prisoners for disobeying him. Not only does he hang him, he hangs him on the ship's mast where everybody could see it, to make sure that they would obey him and that they would do what he asked. And so that kind of gives you an idea of who Christopher Columbus really was deep down inside. And so, unable to control that rowdy crowd, was able to do that and use that prisoner as an example by hanging him. Of course, when they returned, the Spanish caught wind of this, and the Spanish officials arrested him for killing a Spanish citizen. Of course, this kind of created an uproar because the king and queen knew how important he was. He was a kind of a hero to the Spanish nation, being able to find all this new land for Spain and find all these new objects and products and gold. And so it was kind of a street that no one wanted to tread on. But he was sent back in 1500. Of course, now in 1504, he's going to go on his fourth voyage, and by the time he had finished his fourth voyage, he's getting a little older. You can imagine the wear and tear of the trips to and from Spain to what we're going to call the New World. But the one thing I want to talk about here towards the end of the show today is now what becomes of this? What happens kind of between Spain here and the New World? Well, it's called the Columbian Exchange. And we're going to talk a lot about the Columbian Exchange in class tomorrow, so be ready for that. But Columbian Exchange, of course, was the exchange of goods and, unfortunately, bad things like diseases. Obviously, in the New World, people in the Caribbean were not, used to some of the things that were going on in Spain. We're two totally different climates. All right, so some things weren't able to grow there. There were diseases that, that the immune systems that were already in the Caribbean might not have been able to deal with. And so the spread of disease, along with the spread of goods and services as well, became known as the Columbian Exchange. And we'll take a look tomorrow at some of the things that were sent from one side to the other, and why that was so important to not only American history, but also trade as we move forward in exploration to people coming and finding the New World. And that'll just about wrap up things here for Historia Mystoria today. And of course, we're trying to answer the question, did Christopher Columbus actually discover America? And we now know that that answer is no. He never stepped foot in what we know as the United States of America. But what we did learn, number one, Christopher Columbus took 4 voyages to the New World. He was able to discover gold. He was able to set up settlements. He was also able to, unfortunately, send diseases back and forth as well as goods and services from the Old World to the New World. Also, we found out that Christopher Columbus was not a very well-liked man. He was very unsociable. And we'll talk more about that as we go through, comparing him to some of the other explorers that we see coming into the New World in the early 1500s. And of course, lastly, we now know that someone else was responsible for discovering America. Yes, the Vikings were there, but who is America, that what we know as the United States of America, going to be named after? And we'll talk about that here in the near future. What can you expect for tomorrow in class? Well, we're going to be taking a look at Christopher Columbus's diary in a history lab. So tonight, make sure that you continue with your NOMEA lesson. Make sure you answer all of your questions. And then come ready to class tomorrow to kind of debate, discuss, and also look at some of the journal entries and diary entries from Columbus's 4 voyages. Well, until next time, that's all we have. I'm Mr. Sponseller, and I thank you for watching. And until the next time, you're required to hit my button. So long, good night, and happy mystery solving.